All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building, and I'm really excited today because I've got this terrific guest author with us, Ken Liu. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you for having me, Juliet, and thank you everyone for having me.
Ken has been here before. Ken talked about the Grace of Kings with us last time, and this time we're going to talk about this story collection that he has out called The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories. It's a really amazing collection. I mean, we all know that Ken's a really amazing guy, so
Thank you.
surprise there. We're here to compliment you. You know that, right? So how did the collection come about, Ken?
This is kind of funny. So I've had over 120, maybe even more stories published by now, and I've never had a collection. I've had collections in other languages, however. In fact, my Chinese collections, my French collection, and my Japanese collection all came out before there was an English collection. I just never felt that I mean, I wanted to do a collection, but I wanted to wait until there was the right time and the right set of stories to put together something that I would enjoy and feel good about. And so my publisher, Saga Press, which is an imprint of Simon Schuster, they bought my epic fantasy series, and as part of that, they thought, why don't we do a collection of short stories as well, because you don't have one. So I said, okay, yeah, the time felt right because I was shifting from writing a lot of short fiction to doing mostly novels, and then it felt like there was a good transition point in my career where I can do a retrospective and think about what did the short stories mean to me, and what is short fiction as a whole, as an art form, mean to me, and how would I want to represent my work in a collection. And so that's how it sort of came about. And then Joe Mounty, my editor, and I worked together to pick out the stories that we thought would work together. And Joe's really mainly responsible for the sequencing. I sort of let him take the lead on that, and I had my own thoughts, but he mainly did the sequencing. So that's how we ended up with the collection.
Yeah, wow, that's an interesting story, actually. I think it's fascinating that you had stories out in other languages than English before you had them.
It's a little weird, yeah. It's a little weird. Probably not very typical. Yeah, but because I mean, I think the thing is, I have a slightly different profile in different languages. I mean, all my stories are obviously American stories, and they're written in English, but depending on the country, I can sense that there's a preference for one style of story over another in the different countries. So there are some stories that don't work well for Japanese readers, and there are some stories that don't work well for Chinese readers, and there are some stories that don't work well for French readers and Russian readers, and so on. And so I felt somehow more comfortable having a collection out in the other languages because I got a better sense of what the Ken Liu author persona meant to the different audiences. Whereas for English, it was hard because it's sort of like I need to come up with a way to have a selection that's representative of my work as a short fiction writer as a whole, and yet because in my own mind I do very different things, it was hard to pick out the stories that would be representative and yet not feel too eclectic and loose. So that was hard, but my editor was really helpful on that.
Yeah, so like it's almost like in a way that you have so many stories in English because they were written in English that it's harder to sort of say here are the criteria I'm going to use to narrow things down.
Right.
But I think there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff going on in the collection. In terms of, I think the stories are pretty well matched to one another, and they.
Oh, good. Well, you felt that way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do. I think they have they speak to one another in a sense. Sort of like a conversation on thematic topics in a way. So yeah, so I've made a list. I've made a list of some things that I thought were really interesting that came out of the stories, and I'm not really planning to talk about particular stories. Some of the stories I recognize from awards lists, and some of them I know less well.
You actually reprinted one of them, I think, or you
I
wanted
judged
to.
one of them. Yeah,
There you go.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was like, hey, I've read this before, which is kind of fun. So yeah, okay. So let's. I'm trying to sort of think of the way to find my way into this first question. One of the things that I'm seeing in several of the stories is this feeling of iteration. That some of the stories have these sort of interesting lists as part of them. I'm thinking specifically of the bookmaking habits of select species, which is sort of a pure list of here, this species does this sort of interesting thing to create books, and this other species does, and I wonder. That seems to be something that you're very good at, and I wonder how you came to that as an idea or a technique.
So that's really interesting that you point that one out. So here's what that story is really about. So I like experimenting with different forms in short fiction, because short fiction is very amenable to experimental techniques. One of the things about the collection that's kind of interesting is it basically leaves out an entire body of work of mine, the flash fiction. I actually have a large number of flash fiction pieces out, some of which are very much dear to my heart. But none of them are in the collection. We just had to make a decision. I think maybe we could have put a couple of those in there, but I think the feeling was that they would have felt out of place next to the longer stories, and they wouldn't have been given the room to breathe. There's something about the flash form that may work particularly well if they're next to other flash pieces, rather than being overwhelmed by longer stories, because they would feel somehow insubstantial. When in fact, I put a lot of heart into them, and they are an important part of my work. But because of flash fiction and short fiction in general are very amenable to experiments, I do a lot of formal experimentation. So, for example, there's this idea that there's this idea in a lot of our writers' minds and readers' minds of what a story needs to be. It needs to have certain features, needs to have characters, needs to have beginning, middle, and end, and so on and so forth. And I've always been a little resistant to that sort of thing. I've always wanted to resist the idea that narratives follow universal rules, and that stories follow general patterns that can be reduced to a single model myth or something like that. By the way, can people still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write stories that are not stories at all. That was one of the rationales behind trying to do the bookmaking habits of select species. It's an attempt to write a story that is not a story at all. So I wanted to pick a format that made sense. And because I like reading academic papers and theses and so on, I wanted to do a story in that format, something like a scholarly report. And so that's how the bookmaking habits of select species came about. It's a list story in that way. What I wanted to do with it is to present a list format, but also to give it progression. I'm not sure how many readers necessarily read the story the same way I intended it. In a lot of ways, it's really not a story about aliens or books at all. These are just the superficial metaphor used to tell the story I wanted to tell, which is really a story about the way we view, quote unquote, the other, capital O, and how we throughout our history, really, we have this idea of defining cultures as superior or inferior, and then how we read each other as books. It's the only book that really matters in the story is the way cultures read one another. And so this academic narrator is there to attempt to read these different species. And so, there's a lot of I think there's a lot of stuff in there that some readers took to be the point of the story, which is imaginative alien species and how they all make books. And there's a lot of focus on, well, these are not the only ways to make books. How do we know? That's really not the point. The point really is none of these aliens are actually meant to be read as aliens. They are meant to be read as some aspects of us and the way we react to each other and to other cultures. So that's kind of the real metaphor behind it. It's a metaphor about the process of reading each other, of reading culture, and so in some ways it's more about reading as an act of construction, of meaning construction, rather than specifically about the technology of books per se. Though that is certainly another layer to read it. I mean, I also am very interested in the technology of books and bookmaking, and the way we have historically moved from most books being in scroll format to most books being in codex form now, and the way that technology change has shifted the way we read, and how the book as an artifact changes the definition of what is a book. And now we're going through another revolution where, with the advent of the web and of reading being mostly electronic, what is the book as an artifact? Where is that going, and how is that going to evolve?
Right.
These are all very interesting questions too, but they're sort of secondary concerns in the book.
Right.
Anyway, so that's the overall.
Right, and I think that let's see, the other place that I remember you using it was you had it sort of interleaved with another story.
Yeah, this is the Advanced Reader's Picture Book of Comparative Cognition. That's the one? Okay. Yes, that story is sort of a companion piece to the bookmaking habits. It's similar to that story in that it's, again, about an imaginary menagerie of alien species and how they think and what they consider thinking. And it's at the same time a story about our attempts to reach out into space to make connections with quote unquote the other. But it's also really a story about the ways we think about thinking, and the way the metaphor for thinking has changed over time. Humans have had a variety of dominating metaphors for thinking. At one point we thought of thinking as very much like some sort of intangible spiritual thing. At another point we thought of thinking and cognition as very similar to a telegraph network. And sometimes we thought of thinking as kind of like clockwork, very mechanistic. And now we're in this dominant mode where we treat thinking as very much literally computation. I'm not sure any of these models are actually correct. But it is interesting that over time we've had these different metaphors for thinking. So the cognition story really is about, again, the metaphors for thinking and how these metaphors play out and what they mean and how they change the way we think about thinking. Again, they seem to be about aliens, but ultimately the story really is about humans.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because as I read these pieces, I can actually I can almost feel the way that you're taking the metaphor and sort of coming at it from different angles, which is fun. And I'm thinking, was this part of his process? Was he like, okay, what other angles can I come at this from?
Definitely. I mean, I think that has to do with the way I think about science fiction and fantasy in general. I don't think science fiction is about science, and I don't think fantasy is really about magic. I think both of them are really just about literalizing metaphors and playing with them. And so that's my approach. I think that some readers, it does not work for them, because for readers who treat science fiction as actually about science and technology, that is not what I'm interested in. My science fiction, and then my fantasy really is not about magic either. It's both. Whatever I write, they're really about literalizing metaphors. I think that is in fact how a great deal of science fiction fantasy actually works. Frankenstein is really, in my view, not really about science or technology at all. It's about the metaphor, a very old metaphor about creation, and the duty of the creator and to the created, which is why there's that quote from Paradise Lost at the beginning. But this is not a universal view. It is my somewhat idiosyncratic view of how science fiction fantasy works, and so
Right.
that's what I write.
So I want to actually sort of segue a little bit into this other thing, and I think it's related, in fact, because it's sort of this idea that you can take a metaphor and look at it from different angles. There's, in a lot of these stories, you have people looking at the same action or people looking at the same person from different angles, and in a sense subverting each other's judgment about them. I see it in the story about the little girl who was in I believe it was Taiwan, and I also see it in the story about the Chinese fox woman, where you have these different perspectives on what's going on, and it's nice. For example, and I'm sorry that I'm not having the titles pulling up super easily in my head, but the story about the Chinese fox woman, I was kind of delighted when you turned that around and showed us how the fox women would look at the situation. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. That one is called Good Hunting. So Good Hunting starts out like a fantasy, one of those ghost hunter fantasy stories, and then it moves on, and I think readers probably will initially read it as a story about the way the old ways are lost. Somehow magic is gone from the land as technology comes in. But then the second half of the story, I think, hopefully surprises them, because it's really not about that at all. It's really about how there never has been magic. Or magic, it will always be there, depending on your perspective, because the fox demon, who is able to shapeshift between being a woman and a fox, decides that what she would do is she has lost the ability to shapeshift as a result of the coming of British colonialism to China, and the construction of modern railroads and steampunk technology. But she has found a way to recover her power by having an engineer help her to rebuild herself a transformer, a steampunk transformer fox body, so that she can use technology to recover the magical ability that she has lost. So it's really, at the end, she is once again this very powerful being, with her deciding her own fate, turning to this voice of dissent, of protest, constructed with colonial technology to fight against colonialism itself. So the story really is for me, a way to think about the metaphor of change, of transformation. There's no constant. Everybody has to transform, and the question. So I think a lot of times when we talk about cultural preservation and cultural survival, there's a sense in which the thing you want to preserve is something that doesn't change. It's the idea that if you do the same thing your grandparents did and their grandparents did, somehow that is preserving tradition. But it's really not. In reality, as we actually study cultures and view our own cultures, our grandparents made toast an entirely different way than we do. Our grandchildren will not make toast the same way either. A wedding dress has not always been white. The way people got married in China even 50 years ago is completely different from how they do it now, and it will be very different from how they do it in 50 years. Culture and tradition is actually not about not changing. It's always about changing. The question is how vigorously and how actively and how self-driven and how with internal agency do the changes come about. Are you changing because somebody is holding a gun to your head and telling you must change this way or you die? Or are you changing because you believe that this is the way to keep the essence of what you wish to preserve about that tradition and culture alive, and you wish to change in a way that makes things better for you and for your children? That's really sort of the view I'm trying to explore. There are these different ways of thinking about change, a transformation, about tradition, about cultural preservation. And Good Hunting is a story about how there are multiple ways to go about it. And her solution is not the solution. I think the magic is retreating before the advent of technology view would think is natural. But I think given her character and what she values, it's a very rational and hopeful response.
Yeah, I found it that way as well. And I think what you're saying about culture and cultural change speaks to what I've learned, because what I learned is that when you're in speaking language or enacting cultural practices, you're changing them as you do them, right? So you're both recreating them and changing them at the same time, which makes complete sense in this metaphorical framework. So
and this is also, Julia, this is also actually, if you remember in the book Making Habits, there's this very long segment about a species in which their books are really sort of like phonographs that are modified even as they're read. And that's really how I think about culture. It's the actual enacting, the practicing, the performance that also changes the thing that you're performing, and that's a good thing. Culture is alive when it's not a mere repetition of what has come before, but an active transformation towards the future.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. I was like, ooh.
Yeah.
This is a very good collection for language geeks, let me just say. So let's see. Okay, so let's build on the language geek idea here for a minute.
Sure.
One of the things that I really enjoyed is the way that you used Chinese characters in the different stories, and they were, in a sense, metaphorical, and always more than just a symbol, which I thought was fun, because there's a way of putting a symbol on a page where you're just saying, look at this pretty thing as a demonstration of the fact that I know about this pretty thing, and I'll leave it there, and let's not engage with it, but you can enjoy it and whatever. Of course, that's not what you're doing. You're having narrators and characters interact actively with these Chinese characters and kind of pull things out of them, which I think is, in a sense, part of the etymological quality of the Chinese characters. But I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to how you've chosen those.
Okay, so this is pretty awesome as a topic. I can go on forever. I mean, we can sort of talk about this for days and days. So here's something that's interesting. I think a lot of us in the West have a very sort of mysterious view of Chinese characters. We think of them as ideograms, as somehow pictures of ideas, like hieroglyphics in some way. Except hieroglyphics were also phonetic. The impulse to sort of treat the the Chinese characters as though they're just fundamentally different from other systems of writing in some sense is very strong, and so it's easy to make them exotic and to give them a kind of magical quality that they really don't have in their native context. What I wanted to do is to sort of, with these stories, sort of actually give a sense of how characters are actually used and what emotional quality and cultural quality they hold in Chinese culture. So, as a matter of fundamental linguistic fact, the characters are like any other or virtually all known human scripts, primarily phonetic. The characters are there to represent sound. They're there to represent actual speech. There's no magical quality to them. They don't. Now, it is true that some basic character components and very simple characters do start out as pictures of abstract ideas, but they are virtually always used for their phonetic quality. And only as a semantic hint later on. So most Chinese characters, for example, are composed of components. One component is called a semantic root or semantic radical. What it does is it gives you a hint of what the character's meaning might be, whether it refers to a plant or an animal or some kind of mineral, that sort of thing. And the other component gives you a hint as to its sound and how it's supposed to be read. And most characters are composed that way, a phonetic component and a semantic root. Then you put them together, and they're there to represent a word, a sound. And so when you're writing Chinese, you're writing speech the same way you're writing English speech when you type English letters. The difference, though, is because Chinese characters, even though they are phonetic, phoneticization is not the primary design attribute for them. And because there is a lot of the sort of semantic and very old semantic quality to a lot of the characters, the Chinese have always had a kind of playful attitude towards characters in a way that may be a little bit more exuberant than the way we relate to our letters. I mean, it's not that we don't play word games, but our word games are often not necessarily focused on the quality of the shape of the letters, except in something like, say, the Da Vinci Code or Angels and Demons. If you remember in Angels and Demons, there were these ambigrams, which are words that can be read upside down. And that's a little bit of the way a lot of Chinese cultural practices treat the characters. The characters are themselves interesting, and they are playful, and they're not merely recorded speech symbols used to record speech, even though that is their function. They have a cultural significance because they can be played with. They have a lot of interesting design qualities and a lot of cultural significance. So anyway, that's why a lot of the stories in there sort of try to give the readers a sense of what the Chinese cultural practices are with regard to characters. For example, there's a very active practice of folk etymologies where characters are decomposed and their components trace back, and there's an explanation for why the characters are formed the way they are, and sort of explain why this word is written that way. It would be as if we took an English word and broke it down into its components and then tried to explain how the words came to be. For example, this is an example I think from it's a bastardized example from Jane Austen, but Jane Austen's characters often play a game called charades, in which you're trying to guess a word by telling a little riddle about it. And so if you take the word like season, right, S-E-A-S-O-N, you can say, well, what's a season? Well, a season is really the sea and the sea's sun. So that means seasons are derived from the sea because of the sea and the motion of currents and the water cycle. The child of the sea is why we get seasons. That's a preposterous etymology and a preposterous explanation. But a lot of Chinese folk etymologies are like that. You take a character and break down its components, and you give it this kind of playful, silly explanation. a lot of people don't take them seriously at all. They're really just games, but they do give you an extra dimension about how to think about a word and a character. And so that's what the Literalmancer was about. It's about that playful quality of words and significance. And of course, there are because of the way characters are formed, it's easy to change the meaning of them by adding an extra stroke or adding an extra component after the fact. More so than more so than than we can insert extra letters into a word to make it some other word. So in the litigation master and the monkey king in that story, you'll see that at practice. That's a very clever lawyer, proto-lawyer, is clever because he figures out a way to basically modify a single character in a way that's not detectable to change its meaning completely. And that kind of thing, quick thinking and erudition with characters and the facility to play games with them is very much admired in scholars and tricksters in Chinese culture. So I wanted to, bring all of these qualities out to make characters not so mysterious and exotic, but rather to give people a sense of how people who consider themselves culturally Chinese interact with these characters and how they treat them. The characters are not. They do have a very intimate relationship to Chinese culture, not because somehow they're magical, but rather because they have become very intimately woven into the way cultures deal with languages and with writing and with scholarship and with design. It's a very playful relationship. It's very lively. It's not at all the kind of exotic. Somehow you see a character and you get this magical immediate meaning. Some early European scholars thought it's nothing like that at all. It's a much more earthy and, in my view, a more fun relationship.
And I think also there's the character for Umbrella that you use in that's not a character that gets played with by the characters the initial shape in which it's presented is ostensibly something that the narrator has done to it to show something to the person looking at it, right? But also, second-handedly, it's you conveniently showing the shape of the ship
right.
that they're traveling by sort of coinciding with the narrator, I suppose you could say,
right.
and altering the shape of the character in a very playful way.
Right. I mean, that story, Menagerie, is actually about a culturally Japanese protagonist. But a lot of the ways that Japanese scholars and the literate Japanese play with characters is very similar to the tradition in China. The characters, obviously are not magical per se, but culturally they are played with a lot in that way, where their shape is focused on and their components are focused on, and very fanciful visual puns are made. And so that's sort of the idea there. And also, a little bit of that is about characterization as well. The protagonist of Menagerie is somebody who is an interesting character because he is a child. He was only a child before he lost essentially his connection to Japanese culture. So he's had to figure out what it means to be Japanese based on childhood memories and with a sort of self-constructed idea about what it means to be Japanese. And so, of course, his idea is not going to be quote-unquote accurate or authentic in the way that somebody who grows up in a living Japanese culture would. So a lot of it is performative and it's defensive. A lot of it is defensive. It's protective. It's about trying to protect something that is precious precisely because he can't access a living version of it. He is the only person who can keep it alive. And so the way he plays with the character is about somebody who is trying to defend something very precious to him, trying to explain it to an outsider, and trying to show them that this is something very important to him. And so, the use of characters in that story is very much about that. It's about that sense of being protective of something that is important to him, that has been lost to him, and he feels a responsibility for preserving it to the best of his ability, even though he knows he can't do a perfect job.
Well, and it's interesting because he's not able to enact that culture with anyone, so it does end up being something relatively static that needs to be protected.
And he tries to
but
make
you could
it.
argue that in a sense it's already died because it's no longer being reenacted in that way.
Yeah, it's not his, and he was trying to make it alive. He was trying to preserve it, and I think he does succeed because he explains a fundamental idea of the culture that's important to him, to others on the ship, and he by his act of quiet heroism, he allows that essential ability to become part of the culture of the ship, and I think that is a way to transform, to actually allow cultural preservation to work. And then I think as somebody who is bicultural in that context, he was doing something that I think was successful, given all the constraints that he had to work under.
Right. I see that argument. In fact, it makes sense, and it actually, feeds into a larger culture that's going to be different for the people who are on the ship. So that's very cool. Okay, excellent. Let me find my questions.
I'm amazed you had a set of questions written down. That's very organized.
Well, I just have. They're not questions. I admit they're small phrases. Next one on my list is nature of reality.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, so I want to kind of connect nature of reality to this idea that that you construct and reconstruct culture, because that's actually one of the things that I like to think about when I'm thinking in my work is culture what we could, and it clearly is a real and meaningful thing, and yet at the same time it's constantly changing. So it is both a constructed and a real thing at the same time. And I don't know whether that it plays in at all to the way that you look at the nature of reality in the stories that are dealing with, for example, the story about the simulacra.
Yeah.
But I thought it would be an interesting thing to bring up at least. So let's talk about. I think the idea of the nature of reality comes through in a lot of the stories in the collection, even though there are only a couple that are really directly dealing with it. But part of it, I think, is this idea of different perspectives and different perceptions of a reality that's not necessarily going to be captured by all the people, even if they're simultaneously experiencing it. I think that's one of the things that I was seeing, at least at the root of the emotional difficulties between the inventor of the simulacra and his daughter. Right.
So the nature of reality is, a hugely broad and interesting philosophical question, and I think one of the ways you can sort of distinguish between science fiction and fantasy, perhaps, one way you can try to do it is to say that science fiction, in some sense, holds this idea that the world is knowable, that ultimately the world is knowable, whereas fantasy does not really hold to that as an article of faith. Of course, you can argue and quibble with all this stuff. I'm just sort of posing it as a way I think about it. But I think that tension is interesting because it sort of motivates a lot of my work. Because for some of my work, you read it and it's hard to know what I really think, and it's hard to know whether the story posits the idea that the world is knowable or not. I mean, a lot of stories I write do take it as an article of faith that the world is knowable. In fact, my epic fantasy, The Grace of Kings, despite being fantasy, actually is a story that very much holds to the idea that the world is knowable. That's kind of what drives characters. But regardless, a lot of my story sort of meditates on that question and then sort of asks, is the world knowable, and is that even a useful question to ask? Simulacrum is one of the stories that I like a lot, and it is very much about that question. And because it's about humans, the question tends to be even more complicated, because when we're dealing with humans, we have a tendency of trying to reduce people down to one thing. We have a judgment about them. We have one definitive account of them, which is why we talk about the definitive biography of XYZ. When somebody dies, we write an eulogy or an obituary that attempts to summarize their lives in a way that says this is it. And in Chinese, there's a phrase for that, which is something like shutting the coffin. To sort of give a definitive meaning, to give someone a definitive account of them, and the idea. This is a very human impulse to sort of treat the totality of a person's being as knowable, as somehow definitive and a thing that can be pinned down. But I think the reality is that we cannot. There is no such thing as an authentic self. There are just many different performances of the self in different contexts with different people. The way we are with our friends, different groups of friends, is slightly different. The way we present ourselves in a setting with other writers and readers is different from the way we present ourselves with our children. And the way we are with our parents is very different from the way we are with our friends. That's just the way it is. There's no. I don't think you can posit some sort of core authenticity and say that all these are emanations from that core. I think it's much more useful to think that we are fluid entities and we adapt to the context in which we live and present ourselves, and the self is always performed. And that performance, the totality of all performances, is an overlapping reality. There's not a single one that is real. And so Simulacrum is really about that. It's about two people who... Translation.
And translation is a topic that that you've spoken about at length. But for example, when I speak Japanese, I don't feel like I'm enacting myself in it all the same way that I do when I'm enacting myself in English.
Yes, exactly. I mean, code switching is very much about that. It's about. I mean, I think we don't acknowledge enough how much of what we do is dictated by pattern and by habit. We develop different patterns and habits when we grow up with our parents that persist forever, really, into our adulthood. But those patterns only really hold with them. They don't necessarily hold with other people, and there's nothing about either one that's more authentic than the other. That's just the way we are. So in Simulacrum, you got the parent, you got the father and the daughter, and they both end up locking each other into these very rigid views of who they are and who they think the other person is, and they can't move beyond that. And it's really a story ultimately about how we idealize the people we love, often to the point where we love the mask more than the change, and we don't believe people can change. And that's where the tragedy is. Tragedies are caused both because people don't change the way we want to, or people change in the way we don't want them to. And I think sometimes the maturity of love is really about the ability to handle that and to realize that that sometimes the love changes with the person and sometimes it does not. And there's nothing necessarily authentic or inauthentic about either response. It just is part of the human experience.
Right, and things that may have been honest for you at one point may become not as you change, they may not be a correct representation of you anymore, that kind of thing.
Right, but that doesn't mean that the earlier iteration is somehow inauthentic or not for its time. I mean, this is how there's a story that I wrote about this that's actually not in the collection, but it's about the idea that we can fall in love with someone and then we can move on, but it doesn't mean that the love that we experienced at the time wasn't real. It just means that things have changed, and that's okay.
Right. Okay, cool.
Code switching is the word, not code witching. Code switching is really about how you switch to different languages and different dialects or different ways of expressing yourself depending on the context in which you are interacting. So, for example, you will speak in a different way when you're with your friends from your hometown versus people from New York, where you've moved to after college. You will speak to them in different ways, and you will just naturally fall into these different patterns depending on who you're talking to.
Right, and in fact, they've actually seen that if you're talking with somebody whom you like, your language will actually start converging with theirs.
Right.
Whereas if you're talking with somebody that you are feeling aversive to, your language will diverge from theirs. So you will try not to match their mode of speech.
Right.
And this is also related to things like when you go home to your native region, you tend to sort of gravitate back to the accent that you used when you lived there.
And code switching is very much, about performance and presentation. I mean, a lot of us consciously do it, especially people from marginalized backgrounds. They code switch as a way of as a method of social survival and also of social advancement. It's very important as a part of the linguistic practice of individuals and of groups.
Yeah, and also it means switching back and forth between languages. And it can happen on all kinds of different levels. So, like when I was studying in Japan, everybody who was studying in our group developed this sort of it was sort of probably more like 80% English, 20% Japanese mode of speech. Because we were all studying Japanese, and so there were phrases that were part of the conversant dialect that we were all participating in. That would have been absolutely, a form of code switching that was completely idiosyncratic to this social group that we happened to be part of. But was not usable outside, right?
Right.
Because you either had to be speaking Japanese or you had to be speaking English, depending, it depends a lot on the context.
Right.
But as far as, I remember sitting on the train once hearing a Latina girl speaking with her friend, and they were both going back and forth just fluidly between English and Spanish. And it was the coolest thing to listen to, right? And it was clearly something that they felt comfortable doing. That was part of the friendship and the fact that they both shared English and Spanish at the same time. Right. So, yeah. So that's what the code switching sort of is. And there was actually, so there's only really, I'm going to ask you one more thing, and then I'm going to open up to questions. So
sure.
The last thing that I wanted to sort of pull out of what I read was the idea of mirrors. And there aren't too many mirrors in there, but they come out in some really interesting contexts. And I think, again, that you're using them as literal metaphors, but do you have something to say about that?
Yes. I mean, so mirrors show up a lot, and in my stories, specifically, like The Regular is a story in which mirrors play a very important role, and they're very much there. I think the idea here is that, I mean, depending on the story, they play different roles, but overall, the idea of reflection, of reflecting both ourselves and of reflecting other people when we act as mirrors for other people is a very important metaphor for me, because I think a lot of what we do in writing is about reflecting reality in a way that allows us to examine reality in a novel way. When I speak about literalizing metaphors, that's really what it's about. I mean, some people, some writers hold the view that fiction has really nothing to do with real life. I don't quite understand that view. Fiction is sort of incomprehensible without some reference to real life. In fact, fiction is interesting and relatable insofar as it teaches us something about real life or challenges some of our beliefs about real life. And so I do view my work as reflective in that sense, in the sense that I want to write my fiction to emphasize certain aspects of the human experience and to de-emphasize others, and hopefully by using the right metaphors to transform the world. This is world building, right? I mean, world building is about emphasizing certain things, changing things, and de-emphasizing other things, so that it allows the story to say something about what it means to be human, or about the particular experiences of certain groups of humans that may be otherwise unexamined and otherwise not thought about from that perspective. I think a lot of my fiction does work as a mirror in that sense, a distorting mirror or a correcting mirror, depending on your perspective. If you don't agree with the reality that I'm positing, then it's a distorting mirror. But if you do, then it's a corrective mirror, because it tries to correct for biases and misconceptions that the story attempts to point out.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're dealing with a collection which has a lot of different stories. I didn't want to say, oh, well, let's talk about specifically how you constructed this world or that world. And in particular, when you have things like the book Making Habits of Select Species, which goes world, 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 world. In a way, I think this is a meta discussion about the kinds of things that work across the worlds that you've been. So, it's a world building show.
It's a world building show.
So we're
yes.
having our unique angle on it today.
That's right.
Anyway, okay. So, do you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask Ken in the last 5 minutes?
Ken, I'm sort of hugely curious about how your work goes back and forth between different languages.
Okay.
Do you send it out and do you write it in English first and then translate it across? Do you write it in a different language so that it's easier for you to put something together that will appeal to that audience versus another one, or do you do it all in one language first and translate it out from there?
Well, all of my stories are written in English, and they are conceived of in English. I write from the perspective and the literary tradition of an American writer. So of course they're gonna follow that way. I think it's insofar as how translation plays into it, and because I do work as a translator, and I translate a lot of literary and science fiction from Chinese into English, I think I have a better sense of what sort of issues are likely to crop up in translation than perhaps writers who don't do translation as a practice would. And so there are times when I'm working with the translator, I can give them advice on specifically how certain things might be handled. I can give a suggestion, and I can say, this is likely probably the part that will give you some difficulty, and so here's what I think you could do to make it work. But no, I don't do the I always conceive of my stories as really primarily aimed at an American audience, and that is the well, actually, that's not even accurate. Let me put it this way. I conceive of my stories really as always written primarily for me, really. And because I am an American writer, an American reader, they will necessarily probably be more relatable to other Americans. But really, all the stories are really intended to appeal to me only. and that's really the only reader I care about. I don't really think about translation very much, except at the point where translation happens, at which point I give them some advice. So that's how that works. And there was a question about, do other people translate your work? Yes. I work with a lot of translators who, some of them have become good friends of mine, and so you know, there's a nice rapport between us, and there's a way in which we get each other. And I've translated a lot of my friends as well, so that I have a better sense of what it is they're trying to say, and then I think I have a better understanding for their voice and what they think can be changed and can't be changed. Thank you.
Anybody else? All right. Are we done?
Thank you for having me.
I think we're done. Thank you, Ken. This has been really, I have all the notes.
It's been a pleasure always talking with you and with everyone here at Diving into World Building. And I've had a great time, so thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just so you know, next week I have got another treat for you. We're going to have Bo Bolander on the show.
Oh, Bo is awesome.
So that should be really fun, and we're going to talk about Trail of Dead, and that should be really amazing. And before we go off the air, I'm just going to give one plug for my Patreon. Everybody go check out my Patreon because you always want to be part of this. Anyway, thank you so much, Ken. It's been a pleasure, and as always, and good luck. I hope the collection does really, really well for you.
Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful stories. All right, stopping the broadcast now.